Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen, when the snow lay round about, deep and crisp and even. Brightly shone the moon that night, though the frost was cruel, when a poor man came in sight, gathering winter fuel. Hither, page, and stand by me, if thou know'st it telling. Yonder peasant, who is he? Where and what is dwelling? Sire, he lives a good league hence, underneath the mountain, right against the forest fence, by St. Agnes' fountain. Then bring me flesh, and bring me wine, and bring me pine logs hither. Thou and I will see him dine, when we bear them thither. Page and monarch, forth they went together, through the rude winds wild lament, and the bitter weather. If those words rang a Christmas bell in your mind, there's a good chance you've heard them sung by the great Bing Crosby. And yes, I was planning on singing them myself tonight, but then I listened to my better angels and I decided to spare my classmates and professor my unpredictable baritone. This classic Christmas carol was written in 1853 by English hymn writer John Mason Neale, and it retells the legendary charity of a 10th century Bohemian duke, Wenceslas, who later became patron saint of the Czech Republic. His exact deeds may be partly apocryphal, the way George Washington's cherry tree story is, but the Wenceslas tradition has endured because it functions as a powerful narrative model of servant leadership. Tonight, I want to use this familiar Christmas story as a doorway into understanding how servant leadership works, how leaders guide others not by position or authority, but by example, compassion, and moral courage. The Wenceslas narrative resonates today because it captures the heart of what Robert Greenleaf called servant leadership. A leader who begins with a desire to serve first and then chooses to lead as an extension of that service. What I love about this carol is that it isn't abstract or philosophical. It's practical. It shows a leader who gets up from the comforts of his castle, gathers resources with his own hands, and literally walks out into the bitter cold for the sake of a stranger. This is exactly the kind of leadership Greenleaf described in 1970, and it's later echoed in Larry Spear's well-known identification of the 10 characteristics of servant leadership, things like empathy, stewardship, foresight, and commitment to the growth of others. Modern scholarship continues to affirm this pattern. Researchers like Leiden, Wayne, Zhao, and Henderson have demonstrated that when leaders model genuine service, followers experience higher trust, stronger commitment, and deeper motivation. So, even though the Wenceslas story is wrapped in Christmas warmth, its leadership lessons carry real empirical weight. At its core, the story gives us a leader who steps first and invites others to follow. That movement, leader first, follower second, is woven through the carol's structure. Before the page ever acts, he watches the king. Before he ever understands the why, he observes the how. This mirrors the very heartbeat of Spear's servant leadership characteristics. Leaders don't just tell people what matters, they embody it. They model empathy, listening, stewardship, and moral courage in ways that can be observed, practiced, and internalized. Research by Leiden supports this. Servant leaders influence followers most powerfully through visible relational behaviors, not positional authority. People learn how to lead by watching someone lead well, and that connects directly to the Christian understanding of discipleship, learning through imitation, through the example of Christ himself, who leads by serving first. In higher education, leadership is often framed in terms of outcomes, competencies, or administrative effectiveness. But servant leadership reframes the whole conversation. Leadership doesn't begin with strategy, it begins with character. This is one reason servant leadership is gaining traction in student leadership development research. Eva, Robin, Sanjaya, Van Durendonk, and Leiden point out that servant leadership is uniquely effective in contexts where interpersonal influence and personal growth matter, like universities. By prioritizing empathy, listening, and ethical awareness, servant leadership shapes students not just into better thinkers, but into better human beings. This echoes Spear's insights and aligns naturally with Christ's model of leadership, one centered on humility, compassion, and prioritizing the needs of others. For a Christian educator, this framework doesn't feel supplemental, it feels foundational. Today's learners are navigating overwhelming complexity, social fragmentation, digital overload, economic instability, and identity pressures. They don't just need theories, they need models. Servant leadership matters because it equips students to lead with empathy rather than ego, with discernment rather than reaction, and with community-minded purpose rather than self-promotion. Empirical studies continue to support this approach. Leiden and colleagues have found that servant leaders foster stronger psychological safety, greater moral reasoning, and more resilient team cultures. Van Dierendonk's research highlights how servant leadership improves well-being, trust, and meaningful engagement. And for those coming from a Christian worldview, the implications run even deeper. Christ doesn't simply teach servant leadership, he performs it. He shows us that genuine authority flows from compassion, presence, and the willingness to kneel before we lead. This is why servant leadership remains not just a theory, but a transformative practice, especially for students learning how to lead in a broken and complex world. One of my favorite elements of this carol is the page. He's inexperienced, uncertain, and overwhelmed by the bitter cold, but he is willing. In that sense, he represents every emerging leader. He doesn't yet have the strength, wisdom, or resilience of the king, but he has the desire to grow. The page learns by following the king's steps, literally. His formation happens not in a classroom, but in motion, in relationship, and in imitation. And that mirrors how leadership formation actually works. We step into the footprints of someone who has gone before us. We borrow their courage while our own is still being formed. Wenceslas's historical legacy only strengthens his symbolism. He was known in Bohemia as a ruler who defended the poor, resisted corruption, and stood against violent political pressures. Even after his death, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I referred to him as a righteous ruler and defender of the faith. Over time, his reputation grew into a spiritual archetype, an exemplar of generosity, justice, and compassion. So, when the carol shows him trudging through snow with food and firewood, it taps into a centuries-long tradition of viewing Wenceslas as the kind of leader who leads not from the throne, but from the road. We come now to the heart of the entire carol. We hear the page falter under the brutal cold, and Wenceslas speaks one of the most powerful lines in hymnody. Mark my footsteps, my good page, tread thou in them boldly. Thou shalt find the winter's rage, freeze thy blood less coldly. And then the next stanza completes the miracle. In his master's steps he trod, where the snow lay dinted. Heat was in the very sod, which the saint had printed. Together, these two stanzas paint a vivid picture of transformational leadership. Transformational servant leadership. The page finds strength he didn't have, not because he mustered it inwardly, but because the king provided it externally. This is trailblazing leadership. A leader goes first, breaks the path, absorbs the cost, and leaves a trail warm enough for others to walk in. It is also an unmistakable echo of Christ, whose footsteps warm the path of every disciple who follows. When we think about leadership in higher education, the Wenceslas model reminds us that learners grow best when mentors walk ahead of them, not above them. Students don't simply need instruction, they need demonstration. And servant leadership provides that demonstration by prioritizing presence, compassion, and moral courage in action. It says, let me walk this first, so you can walk it next. This is precisely what makes servant leadership such a potent framework for developing students into ethical, empathetic leaders. Project Emmanuel is a course-embedded, service learning intervention designed for undergraduate leadership students, particularly in business or organizational leadership courses. It's inspired by something my family does every Christmas, creating blessing bags and delivering them personally to individuals experiencing homelessness in Chicago. In Project Emmanuel, students would study servant leadership principles, work in teams to identify a local need, assemble care packages or resource bags, deliver them directly to individuals or shelters, and then complete guided reflections tied to the course outcomes. The goal isn't charity alone. The goal is leadership formation, cultivating empathy, humility, courage, and ethical awareness. Research on service learning is clear. It increases empathy. It improves moral reasoning. It deepens understanding of complex social issues, and it strengthens leadership identity. When students embody servant leadership, even through something as simple and profound as offering a blessing bag, they learn the same lesson Wenceslas taught his page. Leadership provides heat. Leadership makes the path less cold for someone else. In conclusion, here's the main takeaway. Servant leadership is timeless because service is timeless. Wenceslas gives us a seasonal reminder, but Christ gives us the eternal model. My hope is that Project Emmanuel, and really this entire reflection, encourages us to be leaders who don't just manage tasks, but who bless people. Thank you all for listening, and may you leave here ready to tread boldly, leaving heat in the sod for those who follow you. Good night.